the carbon and clean energy perspective.
Terrific. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My apologies, I'm not turning on my camera. I warned Scott. I've just returned from a 2-month cross-country camping road trip, and I'm looking a little scruffy, so you're not going to see me today. What I was hoping to do is just give you a quick overview of where things stand in the West on carbon and clean energy policies, mainly with the 3 Western states. And talk about potential market implications that I'm watching for and tee up the conversation that will follow. This first slide here is not, I'm not going to go into this in any depth, but I want to give you a sense of how broadly states are pursuing carbon and clean energy policies. We've got the 3 Western states that are now moving forward with some variant of a cap and trade program. Those same 3 states have also established carbon neutral goals for the electric sector, as well as clean fuel standards, which is also creating demand for clean energy. Many of the other Western states have also various programs in the works, not quite as aggressive as the 3 Western states. And then our Canadian neighbors to the north, British Columbia has long had a carbon tax in place. And also has a clean energy standard. Alberta is not moving forward provincially with aggressive standards, but is subject to federal climate policy, which is effectively going to establish a carbon tax for Alberta's economy. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to jump in with California since we're most familiar with California, and their system has been stable for the longest. So we know that they've had a cap and trade program in place since about 2013. That program currently is relatively stable. I'm not expecting significant changes in program caps or program rules in the near term. However, I think we are likely to see more aggressive program caps post 2030. That's due to a couple of reasons. One, we've got the scoping plan update, which is currently underway. And the scoping plan is the state's broad strategy for how it's going to meet its statewide greenhouse gas goals. And that covers both the emission reductions it hopes to pick up under the cap and trade program, as well as any other regulatory sector, regulatory measures like the RPS, Clean Energy Standard under SB 100, Low Carbon Fuel Standard, the works. That scoping plan for the first time is looking out 20 years. It's now looking out to 2045, which the state has established under Governor Newsom as their carbon neutral target, the point where they want to actually have any remaining emissions balanced by removals. So the implications of that is I think we're going to see more aggressive rates of decline in California in the cap and trade program in the future. We're going to see a greater emphasis on carbon removals outside of the cap and trade program, as well as I think more aggressive policies in other sectors like transportation. With respect to SB 100, which is the state's clean energy standard, that, as you're probably well aware, builds on the state RPS, which is 60% by 2030, and then has a target of 100% zero emission for the electricity sector by 2045. For the time being, that is a REC-based compliance program because we're still operating in the years where the 60% RPS effectively bites and forces procurement. The achievement of the 100% emission standard is currently being implemented solely as a planning exercise through the IRT process in terms of the utilities and the CCAs planning to meet that 100% goal. I've been very curious if whether in some point in time, say post 2030, we see more of a shift to an enforcement type framework beyond the IRP process for SB 100, but no signals yet on whether that's going to happen. Next slide, please. All right, so Washington has had a very active couple of years. This year, for the first time after, I think at least 3 attempts in my recollection, Washington finally passed the cap and trade program. That cap and trade program is very much modeled on and designed to be linkable to the California program with similar coverage, including electricity imports. The program is due to start on January 1 of 2023. What that means is January 1 of 2023 is the date at which entities that are covered by the program would begin to incur compliance obligations for any emissions. I think the first retirement date that we could possibly see for allowances under the Washington program would be autumn of 2024. Rulemaking is just started. Unlike California, they've put a lot of the detail of the program into the actual legislation, so there's not as many areas that the state has to conduct rulemaking. But importantly, they have to develop the program caps and the methods and individual allocation to entities that receive a direct allocation of allowances. They've also got holes there with respect to how they're going to handle greenhouse gas reporting for imported electricity as well, including the EIM. One thing to flag, there is some uncertainty about the enforcement of the program. At the last day when this program was adopted, the Democrats agreed to a provision that would tie the enforcement of the allowance retirement obligation to an increase in the state's gas tax. The governor, when this hit his desk, vetoed that line. Both the Democrats as well as Republicans and stakeholders have said they're going to sue the governor on this. He did lose 2 years ago on a line item veto that was tied to budgeting, so it's unclear. I think this probably will be challenged. If it's thrown out, if the governor loses, all that means is we're back to this uncertainty as to whether the gas tax needs to be increased before the program can be enforced. Which would mean that the retirement obligation is in question. The other big piece, and I'm not covering, just to let you know, Washington is one of the states adopted a low carbon fuel standard this year as well, but I'm not covering this in this presentation. The Clean Energy Transportation Act, which Washington adopted 2 years ago now, is still in play in terms of the rulemaking process. That is, unlike California's, is intended to be a fully REC-based compliance program. What we're still waiting to see some clarity on is the accounting period for compliance. The law itself says 4 years. The environmental community has said, no, that means something far less than 1 year or 4 years, possibly 1 year or even hourly requirements. They've also argued for energy delivery requirements as onerous as possibly demonstrating that clean and renewable energy is delivered directly to utility systems. We're expecting draft rules out of the energy agencies next month. Next slide. Oregon. So Oregon also adopted cap and trade. Well, no, I shouldn't say they adopted. Oregon is using their statutory authority to develop a cap and trade program. Unlike California and Washington, however, that program does not apply to the electricity sector in any form. So both in-state generation and imports are excluded from their program. And that's due to the fact that they did not believe they had statutory authority to regulate those sources. Additionally, the Oregon program is different in that while it allows trading, it is not going to provide an auction of allowances. Instead, those will all be distributed, and then there can be a secondary market for transaction of allowances under the Oregon program. Oregon also did legislatively adopt a clean energy standard this past year, which again aims to get to 100% clean electricity by 2040 in Oregon's case. For utilities, that's an absolute emission reduction goal relative to a baseline. For the energy service suppliers in the state, the targets are denominated as a reduction in emission and test intensity. In other words, tons of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour. Unlike Washington's program, the Oregon program is not REC-based. It's not an RPS-style program. It's based solely on emissions. It's not clear yet. Oregon does have a reporting program for utilities and CCAs to calculate their emissions. It's unclear whether Oregon will make any modifications to its greenhouse gas reporting, and in particular, whether it'll make any modifications to how it considers the emission rate of EIM purchases. Next slide. So just a couple of observations to kick off the next section of the conversation. I think it's clear we're seeing increasing demand for zero emission electricity, and that's both due to the existing and the new regulatory carbon and clean energy programs in states, including the low carbon fuel standards. But we're also, I think, seeing more demand in the voluntary markets in terms of the big entities like Microsoft and Google and those guys putting a lot more emphasis on their own, the electricity that they own for their own businesses. The other thing that I think is problematic and is going to continue to exacerbate seems issues, I believe, is the inconsistent approaches that the states are taking in their clean energy mandates. This is both with respect to whether they're REC-based and the accounting aligns with traditional RPS accounting, or whether they're more delivery-based, where the accounting aligns more with how California does its tracking of imported electricity with the cap and trade program. The other big thing to be aware of is there is absolutely no guarantee that the Oregon and Washington cap and trade programs will be linked to that of California. Washington certainly hopes to. Their program was aligned to look like California's, but it's going to be a heavy lift to try to get that program linked to California's before the first compliance period in Washington. California will not link to Washington or do a two-way linkage until it can assess the environmental integrity of the Washington program. It's going to be looking for consistency in how it treats imported energy, including via the EIM. And those things just will not be clear until Washington has completed its rulemaking and developed its programs. Next slide. What that means for the market. So I'm going to start with the energy markets, and in particular what the Washington program means. And there's a big marker here about ICE transactions at mid-C. Because the way Washington designed its program aligns with California and effectively assigns the carbon obligation to the entity that is the PSE on the tag when power crosses the border, that means that offers at mid-C will be picked up and regulated effectively, the emissions regulated under the program if that power sinks in Washington state. I've had a number of conversations with a lot of folks about the concerns about what this is going to do to the mid-C market, whether it's going to, whether we'll see a decrease in liquidity because of the inability to entities that offer there to control or predict whether carbon's going to be, they need to price carbon in those sales. I think there's likely to be some discussion within the WSPP about the possibility of creating one or more new products for mid-C on ICE that would help deal with this potential risk. EIM is also a big question because both Oregon and Washington need to determine how they're going to treat or attribute emissions for electricity that's imported, or from the perspective of the clean energy standards, electricity that's procured via the EIM. Again, it's hard to predict at this stage because the rulemaking is just starting, and any potential modifications to the EIM or discussions around modification would depend on the outcome of those rulemakings. In terms of the carbon markets, you've probably all observed that the WCI prices, the California and Quebec allowances, are up significantly. I think that's due to a couple of things. I think it's one, due to the fact that the recall election in California was unsuccessful, and Newsom and the program is thus guaranteed to continue. I also think it's an expectation for future demand because of the tightening of the California market in other states. Because of the fact that we won't see linkage of the Oregon and Washington programs to California for several years at least, be aware that we are going, any markets, carbon markets for Oregon and Washington will be independent of the WCI California market. So different prices, different programs. They may trend the same way, the prices may trend the same way, but they will not be a linked market until we have a full two-way linkage. There's a possibility the agencies could adopt some one-way linkages that would allow allowances to be used in other programs. But again, that's dependent on rulemaking. The other thing I think that entities are going to be looking for is some recognition of the other program in terms of transactions that occur between Washington and California. And this might look like some sort of reciprocity in terms of recognizing carbon costs that were already paid in the other program without necessarily allowing for full linkage. And then my last observation is the implications for the REC markets, because I think these are again splitting into different types of markets for different programs. The one big factor here that I think is going to change what these markets look like going forward is that there is growing interest among all the states as well as the environmental community in actually matching delivery of renewable generation to load potentially in real time. And we're seeing that both in terms of this tendency to attribute emissions based on energy delivered rather than RECs procured. I think that means a decreasing role from unbundled RECs, since by definition, those do not involve an energy delivery. And there's also increasing interest in the possibility of Regis generating hourly RECs. So rather than monthly batches of RECs, Regis somehow tracking generation and vintaging RECs on an hourly basis. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Claire. And again, the same rules for asking questions apply. You can either sort of do it in the chat box, the Q&A box at the bottom. You can raise your hand. All these functions we're all used to now are at the bottom. And I've got Mary Lynch from Exelon. Mary, you've got your hand raised. Do you have a question or a reaction?
Mostly a question at this point, Scott. And Claire, I cannot wait to distribute this presentation to my team. It's like so concise, and they're going to love it. And thank you. On your last chart there, can you just describe what happens with one-way linkage? What exactly does that mean would happen as between Oregon and Washington and California? If you could just explain that a little bit more.
Sure. So a full linkage, under a full linkage, we'd basically have a common carbon market. So Oregon and Washington under a full linkage, it would be one auction allowances allowances under both programs. Those would be transacted on the same and tracked in the same tracking system, and either state's allowances could be used in the other state's program for compliance. Under a one-way linkage, you wouldn't have a joint auction, you wouldn't have a joint tracking system necessarily, you'd have to link them somehow, but it would mean that one state, and I think the more likely scenario would be that California allowances could be used for compliance in the Washington state program. California's regulation already has a provision that would allow such a thing to occur, but it would still most likely require a public process and governor's approval in both states to allow that to occur.
And so that would likely increase the demand for our allowances and probably drive the California prices up even higher. Is that the impact there, do you think?
Yeah, and I don't think I don't think we'll see any calls for that until we get some price discovery in Washington, and we cannot get the price discovery in Washington until there's going to be until we see the first allowance auction. We just don't know what those prices are going to look like, and so I would think that if Washington prices end up being high, and my bet would still be that Washington may come in pretty high from the get-go, just because it's a much smaller market. But if in the event that we see higher prices in Washington, that's when I think we would get demand from Washington stakeholders for a one-way linkage.
Okay. And Scott, I did have a couple of other comments on the rec market sections of this chart, but I'm happy to wait if you want to move around a little bit.
No, go right ahead. I'm happy to hear your observations, just so the benefit. I presume, Mary, you're taking this from the perspective of, serving load, because that's, at least in this area, that's Exelon's primary market interest, correct?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And so, Claire, I also think that the bullets, your last bullets on the rec markets, are spot on. We're certainly seeing that in our business. There's lots of interest, especially and primarily by the very big entities that are very committed to sustainable energy, in recognizing that their commitments to solar aren't really having them have a 24/7 green product or green supply. So they're working on that. I don't think you mentioned the extent to which that discussion centers around storage, which is obviously exploding here in California, largely due to some mandates, but also I think because of this desire from some of the big entities. So I think that that's really really spot on. One of the things, and the decreasing role for unbundled RECs has been around for a long time. I mean, those it kind of complicates things here in California, that things like greenie RECs or unbundled RECs are sort of have a very bad rap, if you will, in that they're considered, they're kind of like considered to be fake, like they're not real, as though they didn't really come from renewable energy. One of the problems with that in California that I would note is that because our renewable energy requirements are so high, and now we have the long-term contracting requirements, it's kind of increasingly hard to work out with customers how we can share that, because we need to keep the RECs and the bundled RECs managed in a way that we can count them towards our requirements, at the same time that the entities that are really wanting to show a very green footprint for their energy usage also want to claim the RECs. So that's been a bit of a tough nut to crack in some ways, because obviously all of the rules in all the states are very careful about not allowing double counting. So I would just point that out as a kind of a problem that we're seeing, or sort of an additional rationale for the problems with the decreasing role for unbundled RECs. And then one thing that I wanted to ask you about, Claire, or maybe others on this call, is there a role for the allowances in the CARB market to have a role in terms of greening up supply from some of these entities? In other words, could allowances be retired to substantiate green claims? Is that something that you're hearing about at all?
Mary, it's not something that's come up to my knowledge in Washington and Oregon yet. Washington CETA has some alternative compliance approaches, which include unbundled RECs and what they call energy transformation products. But I've not heard any discussion of allowances. Maybe with the advent of the cap and trade program, that may come up in the future, but it hasn't yet.
And what about in California?
I have not heard it down there either.
No. Okay. Thank you.
So let me let me go, it's interesting because one of the things that's been happening is, and I'm getting this information from WPTF members who participate in the allowances market, that it used to be that all the trading was entirely compliance trading. And it was people just procuring and participating in the card market. And it was trading, right at the floor, because as you know, that they established a floor for these, and the floor is adjusted up, every year a little bit. But so the floor right now is around $17. Right now it's trading around 26. So all of a sudden it jumped up off the floor. And that's a pretty significant jump from something that's been just sort of humming along on the floor, and to the point that Claire made regarding the recall election, like these things don't have market effects. The market went down on the allowances, down about $23, $22, and then after the recall election jumped back up again. So these things do have an effect. So, but and the other point that this participant made, and this market participant didn't necessarily want to brief on it, but the market used to be, as I said, just compliance, and like 90%, people doing it for just their compliance needs. From what I understand now, at least in the California market, it's gone from about 90% to it's 60%. So all of this speculative trading has come in, and this is some people, as Mary was talking about, greening themselves. Some people just actually, I think, perhaps hedging. I mean, we can't know exactly what everybody's reasons are, but obviously, like the ESG movement, the environmental sustainability and governance movement has really picked up steam in terms of there is not a national market, but people are participating in this, and it's a global phenomenon because the Europeans have had their European trading scheme for quite some time, and it typically was down at the floor now, but it's trading at 50 euros, which, okay, that's about $70, depending on the exchange rate. That's about $70 a ton. So it's pretty robust and getting more so, particularly because we've had a certain phenomenon whereby you've had a lot hot summer globally. You had in Europe. You had increased uses or demand for natural gas because there was a noticeable downtick in terms of wind generation, and so you had to cover yourself in terms of the allowances, and so you were buying allowances to sort of cover the fact that you were dispatching more thermal generation to do that, and the same thing has happened here. Is natural gas, particularly in the West, we had really dry, very little hydro to speak of, high usage, low RA margins, and so you were dispatching natural gas a lot, and so you were covering yourself with emissions because you're using additional natural gas to cover that net peak. Those of you in the Eastern Interconnect, it's coming your way, but let me go to a market participant from a generation standpoint, and Calpine, for example, WPTF member, Matt, you guys are both generators, and through Calpine Solutions, you serve load. Is this or is this not affecting your business, or is there something else that's driving the Calpine business, on the generation side?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, and before I answer your question, I just wanted to respond to you and Mary. You guys may know about this already. Probably others on the call know about it as well. But there's a Chicago professor who actually started a company called Climate Vault. I'm not sure how unique it is. But they're actually buying up allowances and retiring them, sort of for ESG purposes. So that's definitely happening.
the market approach to environmental environmental improvements. I love the Chicago school.
Yeah, yeah. So it's not to meet any formal compliance requirements, but yeah, corporations trying to green themselves, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, Scott, just probably I should say a little bit about our business in California and just what I'm seeing. We're a pretty large gas generator in California. We have about 6.
Bad person.
Oh wait, you may have left the meeting before this came up, Scott, but I'm supposed to describe our units as reliability machines now. They're not gas generators.
Just so you know, we were at this and by the way, a shout out to Jan Smutney. He did a great IEP in-person meeting at Fallen Leaf Lake, just outside South Lake Tahoe.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, we thought it was burned down, but it was who was it who came up with that notion? It was,
I think it was the CCA, the Silicon Valley woman,
yeah.
Monica Padilla.
Yeah, said these are not natural gas turbines; these are reliability machines. And we're like, hey, I like that rebranding. We're going with that.
Yeah, yeah. And then somebody else described them as hedging machines. So I got to remember both of those and eliminate gas from my vocabulary.
Exactly.
But yeah, we have a fair amount of reliability machines. Some of which we have some very preliminary efforts to clean those up using carbon capture and sequestration. That's been a big focus of ours lately. But we also have a very large geothermal plant. So I kind of see the renewables market through that lens. And then, our first storage projects just came online and we have a pretty extensive storage pipeline. And Scott, as you mentioned, we do have a retailer and, Calpine Solutions, and they also provide a lot of back office services to CCAs. But I'm going to, most of my comments are going to be from the perspective of a supplier.
Okay.
So, as you indicated, the cap and trade price is finally off the floor. And that, should have been a pretty big deal. And in some ways it has been, but, gas is pretty much on the margin, and even with a higher carbon price, it's still on the margin. And the other thing that happened is just as the carbon price went up, gas prices also went up a lot. So it's a little bit hard to disentangle the effects of the two things, but mostly, we're not seeing carbon impact, kind of how we run or our capacity factors. But we are seeing, higher prices and in certain cases, higher sparks. So that's really in the short term. And then in the somewhat longer term, when we look out to 2030, it just, Claire may have touched on this a little bit, but it just seems like it's actually going to be very difficult to meet the 2030 goal, the 40% below 1990 levels or whatever the target is. So just fundamentally, we're kind of trying to understand what that means for the market and how it clears. And the electricity sector has done pretty well, and we're down to less than 15% of the total emissions or something like that. There'll be a few more hiccups between now and 2030. If we have more drought conditions, and then, Diablo Canyon going away, obviously the last nuclear plant in the state will have a big impact on emissions in the electricity sector. There's a bunch of procurement that's on the way to sort of backfill for that. But it's really the other sectors that will need to pull their weight if we're going to hit the 2030 target. Definitely something for everyone to keep their eyes on. Claire teed up really well. The next thing I wanted to talk about, there are obviously a lot of other carbon policies in California besides cap and trade. Sometimes these are called, complementary programs or complementary measures. And, in the electricity sector, these programs are in some ways, a lot more aggressive, or, are effectively planning to a much higher carbon price than cap and trade. And so, especially kind of in the investment time frame, that's impacting us a lot more than cap and trade itself. So Claire referred to this integrated resources planning process, and that the Public Utility Commission runs, and they just came out with their most recent proposed kind of resource plan. And one of the interesting things that the modeling that they do to develop this plan yields is a marginal abatement cost. And so for the emissions that they're targeting in 2030, that's consistent with $117 per ton marginal abatement costs. And also, Claire alluded to the SB 100, the 60% RPS, and the 100% clean beyond that. But what the PUC is planning to is already higher than a 60% by 2030 RPS. And Claire, I think, rightly characterized IRP as mostly about planning, and suggested that it might be translated into something that's actually enforceable maybe after 2030. But I sort of think that's actually already happening. It kind of is mostly about planning, but there has been procurement that has come out of IRP. It's a little ad hoc. It doesn't always align with the modeling and the planning. But there have been procurement directives from IRP already. Recently, more focused on reliability than on clean energy. So there was a recent mandate essentially for load serving entities to meet their load share of 11.5 gigawatts of new capacity to be online, sort of in between 23 and 28 at the outside, and a lot of that will be storage. Yeah.
So it's got to be net qualifying, right?
Yes. Yeah. And the PUC has suggested that if it saw procurement to meet the clean energy goals, falling short of what they think is needed to meet their 2030 GHG goals, they might mandate similar procurement of clean resources. It's just, so far, I think they've been pretty comfortable that the procurement to meet the RPS that is already in place is sort of sufficient. But even beyond that, and this is I just sort of ideas that have been teed up in this IRP proceeding. The PUC has talked about introducing kind of more programmatic compliance requirements that might look more like I don't know, they could be a clean energy standard, they could be something else. So I actually think IRP is not completely unenforceable. It's not completely unrelated to procurement, and there could be some new kind of clean energy procurement structure developed through IRP before 2030. The last thing I wanted to touch on, and this is really from our perspective as a geothermal generator, it's you know, and Claire and Mary alluded to this as well, but there's a lot more interest in you know, not just buying RECs, but load serving entities actually buying clean energy to match their load. And that comes from a bunch of different places. You know, one place is just, you know, even to meet the RPS requirements, and those have nothing to do with matching clean energy procurement to load. Resources that sort of match the system load shape better are just becoming economically more attractive because the market is so saturated with solar, and just, you know, buying more solar, no matter how cheap it is, that you have to liquidate it at, you know, very, very low or negative prices is becoming less economic. And, you know, obviously that's being offset by more hybrid projects that can shift some of that energy to more valuable hours. But then also, you know, there are these LSE specific IRP, they are just planning requirements, but load serving entities have to do this calculation that sounds similar to sort of the Oregon compliance requirements that are being put in place to show, you know, what they're planning to procure, what emissions that will result in to serve their load. And so geothermal is attractive in this compliance tool, and some load serving entities, you know, view IRP as this planning requirement is not just a planning requirement, and actually procure some of the stuff that they're putting in these spreadsheets. And then, you know, again, as Claire and Mary alluded to, there are a lot of buyers out there who just, regardless of compliance requirements, are very interested in 7x24 green. And we see that with both CCAs as well as corporates. So that's, you know, sort of how we're seeing the carbon and environmental markets right now, Scott, as a supplier with our portfolio.
And the way that it comes across is that there's this carbon market, but with everything that California, this frenetic activity that California's regulators are engaging in, it's kind of incidental because you're being driven by other things. Of course, if this were a nationwide sort of emissions market, a cap and trade market, it probably would begin to have a different effect, because you could actually, like, you know, arbitrage and trade that sort of thing nationally. But
yeah,
I hate to sort of cut off the discussion at that point, because I need to get a question, because we're sort of at the witching hour. I scheduled this, well, I know, but there are a lot of people who we promised we'd do this until 1:30, and they've got NASA had to leave. And I want to keep as many people in the fold as possible. We can all discuss this. But it's sort of the nature of doing a hybrid, and you don't want to keep people on their computers too long. But Travis, you had a question.
Yeah, in honor of being at a law firm, I thought I would ask a legal question to Claire, who I realize is not a lawyer, but it really just asking whether people have considered it. So, you know, in previous iterations of this programming, we've talked about all of the good ideas that have been undone by Western states' paranoia of FERC regulation. And now they've designed a lot of ways around it, try to avoid it, try to, you know, et cetera. So we're hearing now that the RPSs and CES policies that ordinarily would be in the exclusive purview of the state, are going to bundle a trade in energy with RECs. And presumably that will have to give rise to wholesale products of a bundled nature. And those products will presumably be jurisdictional to FERC, as FERC has previously said they are, unlike unbundled RECs, which are not jurisdictional to FERC, or so FERC has said. So Claire, have any states expressed concerns that their highly complex policy design choices will implicate a greater degree of FERC jurisdiction in the future?
I'm not sure that Claire is still with us. Again, she had a personal thing that she had to
It was a
manage.
slightly rhetorical.
And so
I'm still here, Scott.
I'm just trying to honor the notion of what you just said. But if anybody wants to comment on that, or any, Matt, I don't know if you want to comment on what Travis is slightly snarky.
But serious,
observation,
actually.
but it is serious. It is serious. You know. I mean, it is. This is part of the you know, the desire to want to do good, but it's done in so many different policy areas that it becomes very, very difficult to manage.
Yeah.
And as
I'm looking at this, I'm like, this needs some standardization that
Yeah.
only a federal regulator can provide.
well, unfortunately, I think you might need federal legislation for that. But,
Perhaps.
And you're not supposed to, in a Western context, you're not supposed to say standardization.
True.
So-
Harmonization.
Harmonization, exactly.
Harmonization, place at the table for the reliability.
But I do think, and you know, one of the things, just to sort of wrap up this discussion, because of the hour, and I do, and please hold on for a little bit, because I'd like to go around the room at least to get reactions to just anything people have heard from around the table before we close. But the situation is such that we're Ed Randolph from the California Commission staff, he's head of the Energy Division. He had an observation at the IEP event where he talked about, you know, it's necessary for the transportation sector to become much more of a factor here, because as was correctly pointed out, it used to be that the energy sector, our sector, contributed 23 to 24% of carbon emissions in the economy. That's down to 16% now. I mean, we've done a lot. A lot of that's had to do with switching from coal to the natural gas. So it's not that we're necessarily the virtuous, we've been following the economics. But a lot's been done. But what is needed just societally is not necessarily, it is, yes, there needs to be continued improvement. But let's understand that part of the continued improvements will still need certain reliability machines to balance the system. But the rest of the economy needs to be taken into this picture, and yet we're easy to look at, and that's one of the reasons why, for example, in the California context, so much stuff gets thrown at the energy sector. It's like, yeah, we'll get around to the transportation sector, or you know, that sort of thing. So let me close, and also I'm going to go around the table, but if anybody has some chat, some comments that you want to be shared with the rest of the room, please send them to me in the chat box. But let me begin with my FERC guest to just sort of say, by the way, Jet Gebhardt joined us late, but she did participate in parts of the conversation. Jet, is there anything in particular you were able to, that sort of sticks out for you?
Well, first, thank you for hosting the event and having me. I always enjoy coming. Thanks to the presenters for the really fascinating discussion. You know, my takeaway, I came in towards the end of the first presentation, but watching the ongoing discussions about the tension between incrementalism or baby steps towards greater Western integration versus an increasing what I would say drumbeat of need or urgency is something that's really interesting. And you know, I see that a lot from my perspective as a commission and discussions among the commissioners that you see sometimes at open meetings, but hearing it here on you know, the people who actually live it is very interesting too. So that's an important takeaway for me. I also learned that there are endless puns for the word wrap.
Yes, there are. Yes, there are. Andrew Spring just joined us. You used to be up on the 11-4. You're now.
I know one of Jed's stuff.
Oh, okay. All right. So she's in the technical staff. Yeah.
Speaking of course for myself and not for the agency as a whole, one of the things that Claire's presentation really brought home wasn't just the complexity of what different state approaches to how they're implementing these environmental programs, not just from state to state, but within the state itself. Like, I don't know to what extent people are looking at or coordinating different programs within, like, it looks like Washington has like both a RES kind of program and a cap and trade. Like, there's the levels of complexity that people are going to have to manage for to try to both meet all of these different programs that don't necessarily have the same requirements, as well as meeting their resource adequacy requirements. That's a lot, and it seems like there could be some real inefficiencies there.
Travis, we'll go around with Travis.
I'll stand on the strength of my rhetorical question.
I'm good.
But thank you for having me.
Alrighty, thanks for hosting. This has been nice to get everyone together. Yeah, I think the thing that struck me, especially from the first conversation, was, and I think we circled around it a bunch with a number of different comments, is, you know, in any regional arrangement, there is some need to determine that no one is leaning on anyone else, and you can do that in a lot of different ways. You know, right now in the EIM, we look at it every single day. You know, are you coming into real time with an intention to lean? No, you're not. Okay, then you can keep participating. If you're not, no, then you're out. But Jeff talked about, you know, the benefit of when you're making that calculus of are we leaning on each other, of doing that in a coordinated way that then feeds into day ahead in real time. You know, that was the big bar. If you can do that efficiently, the trust that each of the participants have in each other can also have huge efficiency gains. And so the tension between needing to do that and needing to do it in a way that's cost effective, I think kind of struck me.
By the way, John, I just go to board members and then I'll go to you. So, you know,
I don't mind.
So let me go to Mason.
Be short.
Excellent.
Well, sure. I just I was at the end connecting the allowance discussion, layering in if the clean energy performance program, if that's the current name of it, is successful, and we have a federal compliance system that perhaps turns into crediting, connecting that to the first discussion about, you know, what it seems like is the broader regional organization, harmonization, whatever word you want to put around it, you know, is being driven by operational needs, but also then just costs, right? Like expanding costs of meeting the underlying clean energy requirements, which are only going to be ramped up under, you know, some sort of federal program, and just thinking, we're going to be busy, right? I mean, this is this decade to get all of this figured out, and just seeing the struggle that it seems exist in the existing, or the complications around the existing trading systems within the West, it's just going to ramp up even more. So, I mean, it's an exciting time to be doing this stuff, but there are no easy answers.
Let me go to Anne Marie. You seconded to the House Energy Committee, but you're still administratively a FERC person.
Yep.
But and what, from your vantage point, what did you take away from today?
Yeah, so please first thank you again for the invitation. It's great to see everyone be a part of this. I really appreciate it. And of course, the typical disclaimer, not speaking for FERC or for the committee, just for myself. I think my biggest takeaway is it sort of reinforces some of the challenges that I've sort of felt personally, sort of coming from a FERC background where everything is, you know, when we analyze things, it's incredibly fact specific. You look at the circumstances, and then when I've gone over to the committee, you're looking at things naturally from a much larger, higher level view. And I think conversations like this remind me that, and I'm kind of echoing a theme here, that across the country, especially in the area of energy, there's so many nuances and intricacies that you just really can't completely account for, I don't think, in one broad sweeping policy. So I think it just sort of speaks to just the inherent tension between, you know, what's going on the federal level, what's going on the state level, and the regional level. And I just think conversations like this are just so incredibly important to keep happening, so that we can all keep educating each other and not get caught up in what we think people mean or what some fears are or aren't about moving towards more organized markets. So I just appreciate these conversations. I think we need to keep having them.
Nancy, then I'll go to you. Any reactions you have?
All right. Yeah, what I find really interesting is you can, at a high level, think of two different trajectories, Eastern Interconnect and the Western Interconnect. And it is a goal to attain and retain benefits from sort of the broader organized market, sort of the broader, in many cases, the better. But in terms of harmonizing the wholesale markets with increasingly emerging and diverging state policies. And so in the Eastern Interconnect, you're starting with the organized markets,
Right.
and the development of much more specific state policies, where in the Western Interconnect, you're approaching it in the opposite fashion. So I'm really intrigued by, whether and how the way that the Western Interconnect continues to develop in an iterative fashion, apparently. But if there's a greater ability to recognize and respect the differing state policies that are massively getting more complicated. Because that seems to me that certainly has been the challenge of these for a long time. And part of that is because you started with it. You have an organized market in place, and finding how to respect state policies.
And in some respects, that works to the benefit of the West, because, for example, there is nobody who imagines a centralized gas market. Don't need it. Just let's stay DRA and let's rock and roll and do the market, optimize the market around that. We'll do it bilaterally and then through the RTO. In some respects, that's liberating and difficult. I feel like I'm doing penance for having been at PJM when we created the RPM. I'm really sorry. But anyway, let's go to our host. And John, you got any?
You just made me think that maybe I should do penance too, because I was around that crime too. But I just want to follow two things. First of all, Travis's striking comment was perfect. You watch the West struggle not to be.
He had to.
Not to catch the FERC disease, and they seem to be walking in it through the side. And do they even know it? And then Mason made me think. 20 years ago, I remember thinking, gosh, these markets are really complicated. It's just like 3-dimensional chess. Now it's 6-dimensional chess, and there couldn't possibly be any unintended consequences from this.
I've got Matt, and let me to round it out. Matt, Brian, either of you guys have any reactions you want to offer?
No, I mean, Scott, just thanks for inviting me. This was a really good event.
Okay, Brian, if you're still on, I don't know. Sometimes where he is, he gets a PSPS shut off. So. Brian, are you any reactions from Brian Baker? He's the chairman of my board, so I've got to ask. I will just close this by thank you to Skadden for allowing us to do this hybrid. It was an unusual thing. I think it worked out as well as could be expected. Obviously, next year we hope that we'll be filling a big room so we can all get together and chat and then go down the old Ebbet for drinks, as we normally have done. But I'll close with in the West, we're getting someplace. We're making some changes, and they're by and large better changes if you can sort of ignore the sort of hodgepodge of stuff going on at the CPUC. At some point, by the way, we're going to have to rationalize all that stuff. But for the time being, we can ignore that. But it reminds me of that the incrementalism, and Sarah, if you're still on, you'll appreciate this. Back in the 1970s, when Zhou Enlai was still in the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, a French politician had come to see Zhou and had said, was trying to obviously make small talk, and said, well, do you think the French Revolution, 1789, had any influence on the Chinese Communist Revolution, which is in the 1940s? And Zhou, speaking in the late 1970s, said, it's too early to tell. And that's what I call incrementalism. As long as we don't have that kind of incrementalism in the West, then we'll be okay. Let's look for some sort of market integration by 2027. Let's use that as the goal. Anyway, thank you all for your participation. I really appreciate it. And let's continue the discussion.
Yeah.